Hello, I'm Ellen at Be So Creative. I'm in the process of putting binding on a quilt. I'm doing it completely by machine. It's so easy once you learn to do a binding by machine. No hand sewing at all. I've already got my strips made. I'm going to attach them today to this nice little table runner I have. Before I do that, I like to think ahead of what my process is going to be. When I go around this quilt, I'm going to have 4 corners to get around, and I like to use a mitered corner technique, which I will show you. That mitered corner technique involves putting a bit of folding on this corner, which increases the different thicknesses of the seam allowances that are already there. For that reason, I want to be sure that the seam allowance where I've joined together my binding strips does not fall right on a corner, because that's just going to be even more thickness there that I don't need to contend with. So I like to do a little preview going around my quilt, making sure that those joints fall somewhere on the straight edges and not near the corners. And here's how I do that. For this process, I just need my binding strips all sewn together and 2 pins. I start at one end of my binding, and I like to take about an 8 to 10 inch tail. I'm going to use that later to connect my 2 ends. And so this is going to be my starting point, and I'm going to choose any random place somewhere on the side or end of my quilt. I'm going to place 1 pin there, and that's going to be my starting point. Now I'm going to go through and just very loosely, I'm going to roughly lay this binding down where it will probably go. When I get to a corner, I'm just going to pinch it into a little miter. I'm going to come along here, pinch that into a miter. And when I get to this point, I can see right here that I have found one of those joints where my 2 seam bindings were seamed together. I do not want to have that joint so near this corner. I'd like it to be at least 3 inches on either side of the corner. And so I know that I need to go ahead and change my starting point. I can either move it back or I could move it farther up. So I'm going to take this starting point and move it up, about 3 to 4 inches and have a new starting point and start this process over again. There's my miter. This corner's fine now, and there's that joint falling well away from the corner, so I don't need to worry about it. Here's my next mitered corner. And again, here I am at a corner, and there I am with a seam allowance. I do not want that to fall at that corner. I know I have one right here, and so I believe I'm going to shift everything this way about another 3 or 4 inches. So here's my starting point. I'm going to shift it down another 3 inches. Of course, it's a little easier with a small quilt, but you can do the same thing with a large quilt. Just lay it out on a bed or on a big table. And now I feel like I'm going to be free and clear here. There's my miter. I now have my seam allowance far enough away from that corner that it's not going to interfere. I can see that I have plenty of binding to go around this quilt. And so now I know that this will be my start of my sewing for this quilt. And before I sew, I want to take one more pin and I want to mark another spot over here about equal distance, about another, let's say about another 5 inches past the end of the tail that I left. I'm going to put a pin there because that's going to signal me when I get all the way around sewing my binding on, I'm going to stop sewing there so I can leave this much open, and that's the space I'm going to need to come and connect my 2 ends to finish off my binding. Next step, of course, will be attaching that binding to the quilt, and I'll show you that next time.